Hi, I'm Markku Wilenius, a traveling futurist. And now I'm going to tell you about what is future studies. To some people, future studies might sound strange because how you can research something that is not there. It doesn't exist. Future doesn't exist. Well, there is one way that future actually exists. That is, it exists in our heads. We have ideas, we have imaginations, we have all kinds of perceptions about the future. That is exactly how the future exists. So the future studies in the modern form has been come about after the Second World War. Before that time, yes, in the days of the old Greeks, there was an oracle in Delphi who was telling to anybody who came there something about their future. But of course, we're not talking about that. We're talking about rationalizing the future in a way. Even if a lot of the work that has to do with the future goes down also to understanding how our intuition works. But let's go back to define what the future studies is. So future studies as a science really started after the Second World War. And the reason for that was basically that at that time the world entered something which was then later called Cold War. And that was the first time in the human global history where there were weapons of mass destruction on the both sides, on the Soviet side, but on the Western side as well. So some people in the defense organizations in the US, in their research institutions, started to work on something that was later called as scenarios. They started to make a different type of the scenarios. What happens in this age of mass destruction if one of the party moves, the other responds, and then something else happens, and then something else happens, and in the end, we might not have any more the human societies. So different scenarios were built to understand how we can actually prevent those catastrophic consequences to happen. And for that there were people that started to build the idea of how to make rational scenarios about the different options, how future might evolve. Now the first institutions that started to come about kind of in terms of educating people were then later happening in a bit different parts of the world. Some of them came to alive in the US. There was an early effort to start building the first education programs for future studies in the University of Houston. Then there were also some early efforts to do the similar things in England, in Finland, my own home country, was something like a Futurist research center that was started in the early 90s in the University of Turku. And so in different parts they mushroomed this type of educational institute. Also something which is called the Club of Rome was formed. Now we are here in the beautiful Italy, so it's good to talk about the Club of Rome. Club of Rome was the first organization that started to use scenarios to describe the future of humankind. And that happened already in the early 70s, where in MIT, in Massachusetts, in the Institute of Technology, there were the first real efforts to build kind of a simulation models for the global flows, and thereby to understand what if these flows continue in the different intensity, what type of the future it might entail. And The Club of Rome was a non-governmental organization that was initiated by Italian industrialist or Aurelio Peccei. Became concerned about how this ongoing, very intensive industrialization may change the landscape of the earth, may cause the type of the pollution that actually no one wants, to produce unintended consequences. And that's why he built this kind of a loose network of people like him who were concerned about the future. And they came up with this Club of Rome first report, which was named Limits to Growth. And when it was published in 1972, it was a big issue and also big success in terms of being the first one using quantitative terms to kind of play out different scenarios about how the world may look like in terms of its material flows, human flows, pollution flows, industrialization intensity, and many other aspects. What is the type of the future we want to actually build? What's the question? Now, this type of the future studies then later develop into understanding of what are the types of the key methods to address the future issues. Also, an interesting organization called the Millennium Project was formed in those days under the auspices of United Nations, where even today you can find a good amount of critical information and data about the key methods and tools and methodologies around the future studies. All this based on the idea that even if we don't know about the future, we can still say something relevant about it, even if we cannot exactly prevent how the future unfolds. We can say something that steers our minds, put our sight on the right direction, and we start to see things that we probably formerly couldn't see because we were too narrowly looking at how the things move on. Now, all of this has to do with the fact that while the future studies as an academic discipline was developing, the world was changing also. The interconnectivity, the huge, massive globalization that particularly started to take place in the 1950s on, actually meant that the future started to look very different to the past because of this exponential development that was taking place in almost all spheres of life, but particularly when it comes to the economics, financial economy, technology development for certain, and also social, human aspirations. We started to democratize the societies. There was more flow between the different culture, and all of that started to produce a very different type of the society that we have seen this far. Now, this also propelled academics around the world to see a future a little bit different way. And the question was particularly, do we have any kind of a new means and ways how we can actually assess how the future unfolds? So, as I said before, this type of the modeling of the different projections about the future started after the Second World War in the environment of the Cold War. But later on, many other methods started to play their role as well. Different kind of workshop techniques, a technique which is called Delphi, for instance, which kind of builds up expert opinion approach to any particular issue. Try to find where are the similarities, where are the differences about the future perceptions of the experts, and so as an end result, what are the kind of similarities and differences there. But also the corporates started to use foresight and future studies in a very different way, because what they saw from their perspective was that the world is changing very rapidly, and this rapidness of a change made it that they need to put more efforts to understand what is behind the corner, so to say. What is the development in the 5 years from now? How the markets are changing, how we need to be changing according to the markets and according to the needs, and what type of the new political realities there are that we need to be taking account. So all these kind of a strategic foresight ideas became slowly but surely to a kind of everyday language of the corporates, and that change particularly took place in the 1990s and 2000, even if already in 1970s we saw the first example of how the companies were using foresight. The famous example comes from the oil company Shell, who in the early 1970s started to see a little signs that something fundamental was changing in the market, even if there has been a very even development and kind of a agreeable environment in which all parties, kind of stakeholders in that system play their own part. But they saw something coming up, and then once the oil crisis in 1972-73 came along and pushed the price of the barrel very high up, they had been rehearsing this, unlike the other oil companies. So they were much quicker to move into this new environment. And the same thing we actually happened in the course of the pandemic. Some of the nations were very slow to react to the threat of the pandemic, to the threat of the virus, while the others were quite quick in building up policies and action how to deal with this new part that has come into the system. So all of this also played a very critical role when this kind of a complexity started to arise, and people started to understand that, well, unlike in the past, when we move into the future, we need to open up our future and not just to be very focused on what we do, but we need to understand how the future is different, what are those key drivers, key kind of constituencies of the future that will have an impact into the future and make it different to what we have as of today. So the last, let's say, 20 years, we have seen some serious further effort to build different kind of educational institutes, such as where I come from, Finland Future Research Center, which today offers programs for master students internationally, doctoral program as well, different educational initiatives, provides a lot of different kind of projects and consultancies for organization and corporates. And that has emerged out of this need to understand how the future is different and how we're gonna be quick enough not only to react on what the future is, but build our own future knowing this change of the context, if you may. And this is now where we stand today with the future studies. So future studies has become a serious academic discipline that it wasn't 25 years ago or 30 years ago when I started to work on that. Now it is an acknowledged field of research, study and science, and as we speak, new ideas, new methods, new tools are constantly arriving. And of course, with a very new kind of a data available through big data and through a highly developed means of how to deal with the data, we have a totally new era where we can be much more sensitive. Also, those weak little signals that comes from the future, and as they assess their significance to the future of the world. So this was, in a nutshell, the idea of the future studies, and hope it was something that you can, from this on, to think that, okay, I know something about what actually are future studies. Thank you.